Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come sit with me while I read Part 4, the last part of The Mountains of the Moon from the Unicorn Secret series from Kathleen Duey. Please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this book, hit the like button and share this video with all your friends. Chapter 9. All the way to Sandcoville, Hart rehearsed the act. At first, the horn wouldn't stay on Avamir's forehead at all. Hart borrowed Davy's knife. She hollowed out the horn until it was a light, thin shell that weighed almost nothing. Then the pine tar worked. Avamir could toss her head. She could shake her mane. The horn stayed in place. When Kip chased Avamir around in a circle, she reared and looked magnificent. Davy was practicing the fall. He would use the low wire this time, and of course he wouldn't really get hurt. Avamir understood her part of the act the first time they practiced it. "Well," Benny said, "all the old stories talk about unicorns healing people. She knows all about how to do that part." In the evenings, Hart played a dance melody for Talia and Josepha to practice. They decided it should start slowly, then speed up. "You have gotten very good," Zim told her. Hart smiled. Zim played so well. His praise made her blush. "Do you think Moonsilver would get into a wagon and hide there while we put on our show?" Benny asked. Hart's smile faded. She had been so busy rehearsing that she hadn't given Moonsilver a single thought. "Maybe," she said slowly, "but maybe not." "We could send someone to stay with him in the woods," Benny said, "but I'd rather have him close." Hart nodded. "I'm just not sure he will understand." "We had better see," Benny said. We emptied Zim's second wagon is empty just now." Hart nodded. She walked back to the trees. Moonsilver was standing up, not yet asleep. He followed her quietly to the wagons. Avamir came with them. Her forehead was smudged with pine gum. Hart watched Zim make sure there was nothing in the wagon. Then she walked up the little ramp. "Moonsilver," she asked quietly, "would you mind coming inside here?" The unicorn touched his muzzle to the ramp. He stretched out his neck, sniffing at the wagon gate. Then he lowered his head and stepped up into the wagon. There wasn't much room. Hart scrambled out of his way. Moonsilver stood calmly while Zim closed up the back of the wagon. "We'll fill it with sweet straw and fresh grass when we get to Sandcoville," Benny said. Moonsilver nickered. Everyone laughed. Zim opened the wagon gate and Moonsilver backed out. He nuzzled Hart's cheek, then went off to sleep beside his mother and Kip. Hart yawned. "Bed for you too," Benny said. "We'll make sure we get to Sandcoville at dusk, to be safe." Chapter 10. Sandcoville's green was wide and sloped. The people sat uphill from the circle of lanterns. Moonsilver had ridden into town inside the wagon. He stood quietly eating the grass Hart had gathered. When the show started, Hart watched the other acts. It was amazing how many new tricks the gypsies had added. Talia and Josepha danced to her flute music. The audience clapped and clapped. Hart swirled her shawl as they all three bowed. The other acts went on. Benny made jokes. Everyone laughed. Then came the last act. Hart held her breath, standing next to Avamir in the dark. Inside the ring of lanterns, Davy and the other jugglers began. They threw their clubs high in the air. Their hands blurred in the lantern light. Then Davy walked out on the low wire. He threw the clubs high, walking forward. Then he pretended to lose his balance. He dropped the clubs, then fell sideways, catching the wire and swinging himself back up. The audience gasped in relief. But then Davy dropped to the ground. He landed for just an instant on his feet, then sprawled on the ground, his eyes closed. It looked very real. The audience gasped, then groaned. They thought he was really hurt. "Go ahead," Hart said to Avamir. She nudged the mare's side. Avamir galloped forward. and the audience made a low sighing sound when they saw her. She bent to touch her goat horn to Davy's lips. He slowly opened his eyes and stood up. Hart walked forward then, playing her flute. Avamere galloped in graceful circles as they had practiced. Kip ran alongside her. Then Hart changed melodies, and they both came to her. Avamere had even learned to bow like Moonsilver had. The audience stood up, whooping and clapping. Psst! Hart looked around to see Binny gesturing to the side of the field. There, standing in the shadows, were 5 or 6 men in dark clothes. The lantern light glinted from their sword scabbards. They were laughing, shaking their heads. Hart grinned. Perfect. Lord Ermadeath's men had seen the whole thing. She walked to their side of the field and played the melody again. Avamere and Kip ran to her. She patted Avamere's neck and reached up to the goat horn. The pine gum was working perfectly, but she pretended to press the horn in place. She could hear the men laughing behind her. Across the field, she saw Binny grin. She led Avamere and Kip out to bow again. Then she and Zim played a lively tune as people left. Hart couldn't stop smiling. "They'll tell everyone that the unicorn is a fake," Davy said happily. "You can stay with us." "Let's camp outside town," Binny shouted. "I know a good meadow close to the road." All the gypsies went about their work. Hart was grateful. They were tired, but they knew Moonsilver would hate being cooped up all night. And the truth was, they all liked the open country better than any town. The wagons rolled onto the road. Binny knew exactly where the field was. The fire was made quickly. Supper was warm bread and apples. Moonsilver and Avamere grazed quietly in the dark behind the wagons. After supper, everyone else went to bed, but Hart stayed by the fire playing quietly. She was too relieved and too happy to go to sleep. Zim came to stand beside her. He played a melody that danced with hers. Hart closed her eyes and lost herself in the music. "I wonder if anyone in my family plays," she said after they let the song drift into silence. "Where are they?" he asked. Hart shrugged. "All I can remember is Simon Pratt finding me." Zim stared into the fire. "He's the one you followed to Dunraven's castle?" Hart nodded. "I want to find my family." "You should learn to read," Zim said. Hart blinked, startled. "Read?" He nodded. "My mother could. There are books that tell about different towns, about the families who settled them." "Can you read?" Hart asked, trying to keep her voice even. Zim shrugged. "Not really. A little, maybe." Hart pressed her lips together. "Will you keep a secret?" Zim nodded somberly. "All gypsies know how to keep secrets." Hart ran to get the book. She took it out of her carry sack without waking Binny. Coming back, she glanced around the camp. No one else was awake. "I didn't mean to take it," Hart began. She opened the book to the drawing and held it out to Zim. "It's the same design as the embroidering on my blanket." Zim arched his eyebrows. "It is?" Hart nodded. "Exactly. But you can't tell Binny or anyone else about the book, Zim." He frowned. "None of us would tell an outsider." "But if Dunraven's men ever question them, they don't have to lie if they don't know anything," Hart insisted. Zim nodded slowly. "I won't tell anyone else." He looked at the rearing unicorns. Then he placed his finger beneath the tiny patterns. He squinted and stared, then made sounds that seemed not to be words at first. The, he said, the. Hart watched his eyes. They didn't go back and forth like Tony's had. They were glued to a single word as he tried to puzzle it out. Tens? Zim said. He looked up at her, then back at the book. Then it says, mountains of the. He stopped and looked at the sky, then took a big breath and started over on the last word. Moo. No, Mao. No, it's moo, then Moon? He looked up smiling. Hart waited, holding her breath. The mountains of the moon, he said slowly. Then he frowned. That must be wrong, Hart. It makes no sense at all. Hart stood completely still. In her dreams, the mountains were the color of the full moon. Did the book say something about her dreams? Have you ever heard of the mountains of the moon? Hart asked. Zim shrugged. No, but... Hart, you need someone who can truly read. Gypsies don't. My mother was a town woman. She taught me a little, but I've forgotten most of it. Try again, Hart pleaded. Zim tried. He wrinkled his face and stared at the book. He pushed his finger back and forth over the same place a dozen times. And, he began. Then he looked up. It's a long word. I can't remember enough of the letters, he stared at it again. Letters? Hart echoed. That's what the little designs are called. Letters. He handed the book back to her. I'm sorry, Hart. Hart hugged him. I love you all so much, she said, not knowing that she was going to say it. Everyone missed you, Zim said. Then he smiled. Avamere and Moonsilver are lucky that you found them. And Kip. He rose and stretched. As he walked toward his wagon, Hart glanced up at the sky. Zim had done his best. She would have to learn to read somehow. She smiled up at the sky. At least she could travel with the gypsies now. That meant she might be able to find someone who knew something about the drawing of the rearing unicorns. It might lead her to her family, her real home. Home. Hart whispered the word as Zim started off to bed. It was a magic word for her. Hart turned toward Benny's wagon. Past it, on the horizon, the moon was rising. It was almost full again. Hart watched it. The bracelet on her wrist felt snug and warm against her skin. She breathed in the chilly night air. The unicorns were asleep, and so was Kip. They were all safe for now, and her family would help her. All she had to do was find them.